The most satisfying moment of my life wasn't when my father begged me for help. It wasn't when my brother lost everything. And it wasn't when the people who spent decades overlooking me finally admitted they were wrong. The most satisfying moment happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I looked across a conference table and realized that nobody in that room had any power over me anymore. Not my father, not my brother, not the family business, not the expectations that had controlled my entire life. But it took 40 years of disappointment to get there. My name is Daniel. I'm 41 years old, and for most of my life, I was the son my family tolerated while they celebrated my older brother, Jason. Jason was 2 years older than me. According to my father, that made him special. Growing up, I watched Jason receive praise for things that barely earned acknowledgement when I did them. If Jason got a B on a test, Dad would take him out for ice cream. If I got an A, Dad would nod and ask why I missed the extra credit question. If Jason helped around the house, he was responsible. If I helped around the house, I was simply doing what was expected. I know that sounds dramatic, but anyone who grows up as the less favored child understands exactly what I'm talking about. It's not one big moment. It's thousands of little moments. Tiny reminders that someone else matters more. Our father owned a manufacturing company that my grandfather started after returning from the military. It wasn't some giant corporation. It was a respectable regional business with around 80 employees. For decades, everyone assumed Jason would inherit it, including Jason, including my father, including most of our relatives. The strange thing was that Jason never showed much interest in the company. He loved the idea of being the future owner. He loved the respect. He loved introducing himself as the heir. But actual work, that was a different story. Meanwhile, I genuinely cared. When I was 14, I spent summers helping in the warehouse. At 16, I learned inventory management. At 18, I was helping supervisors solve scheduling problems. I loved the business. I loved understanding how everything worked. I loved the challenge of improving systems. But every time I suggested an idea, Dad would say something like, "That's nice, son." Then he'd turn to Jason and ask his opinion. Even when Jason clearly hadn't been paying attention. My mother noticed it too. A few times she tried talking to Dad. I overheard one argument when I was 17. "Daniel works harder than anyone," Mom said. Dad sighed. "Jason has leadership qualities." "What leadership qualities?" "People naturally follow him." I remember sitting in my room laughing at that, because nobody followed Jason. People cleaned up after Jason. There was a difference. Still, I kept trying. Maybe because I wanted my father's approval. Maybe because I genuinely loved the company. Maybe because I thought hard work would eventually matter. After college, I joined the business full-time. Jason joined too. Within 6 months, the differences were obvious. I arrived early. Jason arrived late. I solved problems. Jason created them. I built relationships with employees. Jason memorized corporate buzzwords and repeated them in meetings. Yet somehow Dad remained convinced Jason was the future. Whenever someone praised my work, Dad found a way to redirect the conversation. Whenever Jason completed the bare minimum, Dad acted like he'd cured cancer. At family gatherings, relatives constantly asked Jason about his plans for the company. Nobody asked mine. One Thanksgiving, an uncle actually looked at me and said, "You'll be a great support for Jason when he takes over." Support? I was 30 years old. I'd spent more than a decade helping run the company, and people still saw me as the assistant. That should have been my warning, but I kept believing effort would eventually matter. I had no idea that my biggest humiliation was still coming, and when it arrived, it changed the course of my entire life. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. Everyone else certainly did. The employees knew, our relatives knew, even my mother seemed to know. The only person who didn't see it was me, because a part of me still believed that when the moment of truth arrived, my father would choose competence over favoritism. I was wrong, painfully wrong. The announcement happened during the company's annual leadership meeting. It was supposed to be a routine event. Department heads, senior managers, supervisors, and a few long-time employees gathered in the conference room every year to discuss goals and strategy. I had spent weeks preparing reports, production numbers, efficiency improvements, cost-saving measures, growth projections, the same things I always handled. Jason, meanwhile, spent most of those weeks golfing with clients and posting motivational quotes on social media. Nobody expected much from him, including me. When the meeting started, everything seemed normal. Dad gave his usual speech about the company's history, the importance of family, the responsibility of leadership. Then he smiled. The kind of smile that meant he had planned something. "I have an important announcement." The room went quiet. Dad stood up and adjusted his tie. "As many of you know, I've been thinking about the future." Several managers exchanged glances. My stomach tightened. "I've decided it's time to begin transitioning leadership to the next generation." The room erupted into polite applause. I glanced at Jason. He looked smug, like he already knew. And in that moment, I felt something cold settle in my chest. Dad continued. Effective immediately, Jason will become executive vice president and successor to the company. The applause continued, but I barely heard it. Because all I could think was, that's it. After 20 years, after every late night, every sacrifice, every problem solved, every department rebuilt, every crisis managed, that's it. I looked around the room. Some people were smiling politely. Others looked uncomfortable. A few avoided eye contact entirely. They knew. Everyone knew. Jason stood and shook Dad's hand. The gesture looked rehearsed. Maybe it was. Then Dad said something that made it worse. Much worse. And Daniel will continue providing operational support during the transition. Operational support? I wasn't a future leader. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't even being recognized for everything I'd done. I was support. A supporting character in Jason's success story. The room applauded again. I wanted to walk out. Instead, I sat there and smiled. Years of practice had taught me how to hide disappointment. The meeting continued. Jason gave a speech. A terrible speech. He talked about innovation, vision, synergy, growth, not a single concrete idea, not one, just empty corporate nonsense. Yet Dad sat there looking proud. Afterward, employees approached Jason to congratulate him. Several eventually came to me too, not to congratulate me, to apologize without actually saying the word. One supervisor pulled me aside. Daniel, he hesitated. I'm sorry. That was all he said, but I understood. The entire company understood. The wrong son had been chosen. That evening, my mother came to my house. She looked exhausted. I argued with him. I knew exactly who she meant. Did it help? She laughed bitterly. No, we sat in silence for a while. Then she asked the question neither of us wanted to ask. What are you going to do? I didn't have an answer, because despite everything, I still loved the company. I loved the employees. I loved the work. Leaving felt impossible, so I stayed. And for the next 3 years, I watched Jason slowly destroy everything my grandfather had built. At first, the damage was subtle. Small mistakes. Bad decisions, ignored warnings. But incompetence has a way of compounding. One bad choice becomes 10, 10 become 50, and eventually the consequences become impossible to hide. Jason started replacing experienced managers with friends. Friends who had no industry knowledge. Friends who agreed with everything he said. Friends who treated the company like a social club. Production delays increased. Customer complaints multiplied. Longtime employees started resigning. Whenever I raised concerns, Jason accused me of being negative. Whenever managers raised concerns, he accused them of resisting change. And Dad defended him every single time. He needs room to grow. He'll learn. Leadership requires confidence. Confidence wasn't the problem, competence was, but nobody wanted to hear that. The first major client left 18 months later, then another, then another. Millions of dollars vanished. Still, Jason insisted everything was fine. Then he bought himself a new luxury car, then a vacation home, then expensive memberships and perks. The company was bleeding. Jason was spending. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Employees started joking that the business wasn't funding operations anymore. It was funding Jason's lifestyle. The jokes stopped being funny when layoffs began. Good people lost jobs, families suffered. Meanwhile, Jason blamed market conditions, supply chains, economic uncertainty, anything except himself. And through all of it, my father stood beside him, protecting him, excusing him, defending him the same way he always had. But reality doesn't care about favoritism. Numbers don't care about family politics. And eventually reality came knocking, hard. By the beginning of the third year, the company was facing a financial crisis so severe that even Dad couldn't deny it anymore. The bank was asking questions. Major clients were leaving. Cash reserves were disappearing. Vendors were demanding payment. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my father's eyes. Real fear. The kind that comes when decades of work are about to collapse. And soon enough, the man who spent my entire life treating me like the backup option would come to my door. Not as a father, not as a boss, but as a desperate man with nowhere left to turn. And what happened next would change our family forever. The knock came on a Sunday morning. I remember the exact moment because I had spent the previous 6 months building something that finally belonged to me. Something nobody could take credit for. Something nobody could hand to Jason. After years of watching the family business ignore my ideas, I had left. Not dramatically, not with a shouting match, not with some grand speech. I simply resigned. And for the first time since I was 22 years old, I walked away. The decision hadn't been easy. The company felt like part of my identity. I had spent nearly 2 decades helping build it. But eventually I realized something painful. You can't save something when the people in charge don't want to be saved. So I left. A few former clients reached out almost immediately. Then more, then more. Within a year, I had started my own consulting company, nothing flashy. Just operational management and efficiency consulting for manufacturing firms. The exact kind of work I loved. The exact kind of work I'd been doing for years. Only now people actually listened. The business grew faster than I expected. Former clients recommended me. Former employees referred new customers. Word spread. For the first time in my life, my success belonged entirely to me. No father standing in front of me. No brother taking credit. No family politics. Just results. That's why I remember that Sunday morning so clearly. I was reviewing proposals for 3 new contracts when somebody knocked on my front door. When I opened it, I froze. My father stood there. Alone, and he looked old, not physically old, defeated old. The kind of exhaustion that settles into someone's face after months of losing battles. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I never expected to hear. "Can we talk?" I invited him inside. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I'd spent years helping my own children with homework. The same table where I'd promised myself I would never make them compete for my approval the way Jason and I had. Dad looked around the room, then back at me. "The company is in trouble." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was the most obvious statement imaginable. Everyone knew, employees knew, customers knew, suppliers knew, the bank definitely knew. The only people who hadn't seemed aware of it were Dad and Jason. "I know," he nodded slowly. "Much worse than people realize." I didn't say anything, I just waited. Eventually he sighed. "We may not survive the year." There it was, the truth. The thing he'd probably spent months avoiding. The thing pride had prevented him from saying. The company was dying. And suddenly I felt something strange. Not happiness, not revenge, just sadness. Because despite everything, this business had once meant something to me. It was my grandfather's dream, my father's life's work, the place where dozens of families earned their living. Watching it collapse wasn't satisfying, it was tragic. Dad leaned forward. "We need help." We, not Jason, not the leadership team, not the successor he'd chosen. I already knew where this conversation was heading, and somehow that made it worse. "Have you talked to Jason?" The silence lasted several seconds. Finally, Dad answered. "Jason isn't handling it well." That was the polite version. The real version arrived a few minutes later. As the conversation continued, the full picture emerged. Jason had been making increasingly reckless decisions, taking on unnecessary debt, ignoring financial warnings, approving projects that made no sense, spending money they didn't have. Several senior managers had resigned. Others were actively searching for new jobs. The board had lost confidence. The bank had lost patience. Clients had lost trust. Everything was unraveling, and for the first time ever, nobody could blame anyone else. Not market conditions, not competitors, not bad luck. Jason had failed completely. I listened quietly, not because I enjoyed hearing it, because I had warned them about every single one of these problems years earlier. Every single one. When Dad finally finished, he looked at me. Then came the sentence I'd waited my entire life to hear. "I should have listened to you." For a moment I thought I imagined it, because those words had never existed in my father's vocabulary, not when I was a child, not when I was a teenager, not when I was an adult, certainly not when he chose Jason over me. Yet there he was, looking directly at me, saying them out loud. "I should have listened to you." The strange thing was that hearing it didn't feel as good as I'd imagined. Maybe because it came 20 years too late. Maybe because so much damage had already been done. Maybe because I wasn't the same person anymore. Dad continued. "We need someone to help turn things around." There it was. The real reason he'd come. Not to apologize, not to reconnect, not to repair our relationship. He needed something. Specifically, he needed me. The son who had never been good enough. The son who was supposed to provide operational support. The son who had spent decades standing in his brother's shadow. Now suddenly I was important. I stared at him for a long moment. Then I asked a question. "Where's Jason?" Dad's expression changed instantly. And in that moment I knew the answer wasn't going to be good. Not good at all. Because whatever was happening behind the scenes, Jason wasn't just failing anymore. He was panicking. And panic was about to make him do something that would destroy the last bit of sympathy anyone still had for him, including me. My father looked away the moment I asked about Jason. That alone told me more than any answer could. For most of my life, Dad had defended my brother with the dedication of a lawyer protecting his only client. No matter what Jason did, there was always an excuse, always a reason, always someone else to blame. But now Dad couldn't even make eye contact. "Jason is struggling." I almost smiled. That was the understatement of the century. "Struggling how?" Dad rubbed his forehead. The hesitation lasted several seconds. Then the truth started spilling out, not all at once, piece by piece, like someone reluctantly pulling a bandage off a wound. Apparently, after months of declining revenue and mounting pressure, Jason had become obsessed with maintaining appearances. Instead of fixing problems, he focused on hiding them. He manipulated reports, delayed bad news, made optimistic projections that had no basis in reality. Every time the situation worsened, he simply created a bigger lie to cover the previous one. And eventually those lies became impossible to maintain. The board discovered discrepancies. The bank demanded explanations. Several financial reviews uncovered information Jason had conveniently failed to mention. Nothing technically criminal, at least not yet, but enough to destroy trust. Enough to make everyone question everything, including my father. How much did he hide? Dad's silence answered before his mouth did. A lot, far more than anyone wanted to admit. I leaned back in my chair. For years I had imagined this moment. The moment when reality finally caught up with Jason. The moment when his charm stopped working. The moment when excuses ran out. Yet somehow it wasn't satisfying. It was just sad, because dozens of employees were paying the price. Families who depended on those paychecks. People who had devoted decades to the company. People who trusted leadership to make responsible decisions. Jason wasn't the only victim of his failures, not even close. Dad finally looked at me. He's under a lot of pressure. There it was, the old reflex, the familiar defense. The instinct to protect Jason, even now, even after everything. And suddenly something inside me snapped. Not anger, clarity. The kind that only comes after years of swallowing disappointment. Pressure. Dad blinked. I continued. Where was that concern when I worked 80-hour weeks? Silence. Where was that concern when I warned everyone about these problems? More silence. Where was that concern when I spent years fixing issues Jason created? Dad lowered his eyes. For the first time in my life, he didn't argue, because he couldn't. The facts were too obvious. The evidence was too overwhelming. The golden child narrative had finally collapsed under its own weight, and everyone knew it, including him. A few moments later, Dad said something unexpected. Your mother warned me. That caught my attention. About what? About Jason? I stared at him. Dad sighed heavily. She warned me years ago. Apparently, Mom had been telling him the same thing for decades. Jason avoided responsibility. Jason expected special treatment. Jason relied on other people to clean up his mistakes. Jason loved recognition more than actual work. Everything she predicted had happened. Exactly. And Dad had ignored every warning, because admitting she was right would have required admitting he was wrong, something he rarely did. Why are you telling me this now? Dad laughed bitterly. Because I don't have the luxury of lying to myself anymore. That answer stayed with me, because for the first time I believed him. The confident businessman who always had answers was gone. The stubborn father who believed favoritism could somehow change reality was gone. All that remained was a man watching his life's work crumble, and finally understanding why. Then came the part that surprised me most. Dad reached into a folder he'd brought with him. Several papers slid across the table. Financial statements, debt summaries, cash flow reports. I spent 15 minutes reviewing everything. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. Much worse. This wasn't a company with problems. This was a company standing at the edge of a cliff. One bad quarter from disaster. One missed obligation from collapse. One more major client loss from bankruptcy. I understood immediately why Dad had come to me. He wasn't looking for advice. He was looking for a miracle. The problem was that miracles are expensive, especially after years of being ignored. I placed the papers back on the table. Then I asked the question that changed everything. What exactly do you want from me? Dad hesitated, then answered. I want you to come back. There it was. Simple, direct, terrifying, not as a consultant, not as temporary help. He wanted me back inside the company, back under the same roof, back in the same system that had spent decades treating me as second best. For a few seconds, I genuinely didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh. Part of me wanted to walk away. Part of me wanted to remind him of every opportunity he'd given Jason instead of me. But another part remembered the employees, the people who weren't responsible for any of this, the people whose livelihoods depended on what happened next. I remained quiet, and that's when Dad said the sentence that stunned me. If you come back, you'll have full authority. I looked up. Full authority? He nodded. Over everything. For a moment, I thought I misheard him, because 3 years earlier, he wouldn't even let me influence major decisions. Now he was offering complete control. The irony was unbelievable, but before I could respond, another voice suddenly interrupted. A furious voice. One I recognized immediately. The front door slammed open. Heavy footsteps thundered through the house, and then Jason appeared in my kitchen, red-faced, angry, panicked, desperate. The golden child had finally arrived, and judging by the look on his face, he had absolutely no intention of surrendering his throne without a fight. The second Jason stepped into my kitchen, I knew this wasn't going to be a civil conversation. His face was bright red. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought he might crack a tooth. And the moment his eyes landed on the financial reports spread across my table, whatever self-control he had left disappeared. What the hell is this? Dad immediately stood. Jason, no. Jason pointed directly at me. No. I want to know what he's doing. I stayed seated. Years ago, that level of aggression would have rattled me. Not anymore. Because for the first time in our lives, I wasn't the one who needed something. He was, and deep down, he knew it. Dad tried again. Sit down. Jason ignored him. Instead, he looked at me with the same expression he'd worn his entire life whenever reality threatened his position. Contempt. The problem was that contempt only works when you're winning. And Jason wasn't winning anymore, not even close. "You're trying to take my company?" I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. "Your company?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. Jason's face darkened instantly. Dad looked uncomfortable. Good, both of them needed to hear it. "Jason, you've spent 3 years driving it into a wall. That's not what happened." "No," I gestured toward the financial reports. "The numbers disagree." His eyes flicked toward the paperwork just for a second, but it was enough. That tiny reaction told me everything. He already knew how bad things were. He wasn't ignorant. He wasn't confused. He wasn't being blindsided. He knew. And somehow that made it worse. Because it meant every terrible decision had been made despite understanding the consequences. The argument exploded from there. For nearly an hour, Jason blamed everyone except himself. The economy, the market, clients, managers, employees, suppliers, banks, competitors, technology, bad timing, literally everything except Jason. At one point, he actually blamed a warehouse supervisor who had retired 2 years earlier. I wish I were joking. Dad listened quietly. For the first time in my life, he wasn't rushing to defend him. That seemed to bother Jason even more than my criticism. Eventually, he turned toward Dad. "You can't seriously be considering this." Dad didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation changed everything. Because Jason finally realized what was happening. For the first time in his life, his father's loyalty wasn't guaranteed. The fear on his face was almost shocking. Not because he was afraid of losing the company. Because he was afraid of losing the protection, the safety net, the special treatment, the thing he'd relied on his entire life. "You're choosing him." Dad closed his eyes. "No." "Yes, you are." "No, Jason." His voice sounded tired. Exhausted. "We're trying to save the company." That sentence landed like a bomb, because hidden inside those 6 words was a truth nobody had dared say aloud. The company needed saving, which meant Jason had failed completely, publicly. Undeniably, for years he had been the chosen son, the future leader, the heir, the golden child. Now suddenly he was the problem, and he couldn't handle it. People often assume spoiled children become arrogant because they think they're superior. Sometimes that's true, but more often they're terrified that if people stop protecting them, they'll be exposed. Jason was being exposed, right there, in real time, and he was panicking. Then he made a mistake, a huge mistake. The kind of mistake that permanently changes how people see you. He turned toward me, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile, a cruel one, the same smile he'd worn as kids whenever he knew he'd get away with something. "You think you're special because you started some little consulting company?" Dad looked stunned. I remained silent. Jason kept going. "You've always been jealous." There it was, the family narrative. The lie they'd been telling themselves for decades. Not that I was overlooked, not that I was treated unfairly, not that I'd earned opportunities Jason received automatically. No, according to Jason, I was simply jealous. Jealous of what? His failures, his debt, his collapsing business, his destroyed reputation. The irony was incredible, but he wasn't finished. "You've spent your whole life waiting for me to fail." That one actually hurt, because it was so completely wrong. I never wanted him to fail. I wanted him to succeed responsibly. I wanted the company to thrive. I wanted my father to be proud of both sons. The tragedy was that none of those things happened. And now Jason was rewriting history to protect his ego. The worst part? For years, Dad probably would have believed him. Not today. Today something different happened. Dad stood up. And for the first time in our lives, he looked directly at Jason and said, "Enough." The room went silent. Jason froze. I froze, because neither of us had ever heard that tone before. Dad wasn't angry. Anger passes. This was disappointment. Deep disappointment, the kind that settles into a person's bones. "You need to stop blaming other people." Jason stared at him, almost like he couldn't process what he'd heard. Dad continued, "The company is where it is because of your decisions." Jason looked genuinely shocked. Not defensive, not angry, shocked. As though hearing consequences attached to his actions was a completely new experience. Maybe it was. Then Dad delivered the sentence that changed our entire family forever. "Your brother warned us." Silence. Repeatedly, more silence. And he was right. For 40 years, those words belonged to Jason. Jason was right. Jason was talented. Jason was the future. Jason was the leader. Now suddenly they belonged to me, and Jason couldn't stand it. His face twisted with rage. Then he grabbed his coat and stormed toward the door. Before leaving, he stopped, turned around, and pointed directly at me. "If he comes back, I'm done." The front door slammed so hard it shook the walls. The house became silent, a long silence, the kind that follows something irreversible. Dad sat back down slowly. Older somehow, smaller, defeated. Then he whispered something I never expected to hear. "Maybe that's for the best." And in that moment, I realized something astonishing. The golden child era was over, completely over. But what neither of us knew yet was that Jason wasn't walking away quietly. Because over the next few weeks, he would make one final desperate move. A move so selfish, so reckless, and so unbelievably stupid that it would destroy the last scraps of sympathy anyone still had for him, including our father. And when the truth finally came out, the karma would be absolutely brutal. For the next 2 weeks, I didn't give my father an answer, partly because I needed time, partly because I didn't trust the situation, and partly because I knew something neither Dad nor the board seemed willing to admit. Companies don't collapse overnight. Not usually. The kind of financial disaster we were seeing takes time, months, sometimes years, which meant there were probably still things hidden beneath the surface, things nobody had discovered yet. As it turned out, I was right, very right. The first warning came from an old friend named Michael. Michael had worked in the company's accounting department for nearly 15 years. He was one of the most careful people I'd ever met, the kind of person who noticed when a decimal point was in the wrong place. One evening he called me. His voice sounded nervous. "Daniel, I need to show you something." That immediately got my attention. Michael wasn't dramatic. If he sounded worried, there was a reason. We met the following morning. The moment I saw the folder he carried, I knew this wasn't going to be good. I was wrong. It was much worse than not good. For nearly an hour, Michael walked me through a series of transactions. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Consulting expenses, vendor payments, marketing contracts, business development costs, normal corporate spending. But the deeper we dug, the stranger things became. Several vendors appeared to have little or no actual work product. A handful of contracts seemed wildly overpriced. Certain payments were routed through companies with almost no operating history. The pattern wasn't obvious enough to trigger immediate alarms, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Someone had been draining money from the company. Not millions, at least not directly, but enough to matter, enough to hurt, enough to raise serious questions. I sat there staring at the paperwork, trying to understand what I was looking at. Then Michael dropped the bomb. Several of the companies receiving payments had connections to Jason's personal friends. The room suddenly felt smaller. "You're sure?" Michael nodded. "Very." I looked back down at the reports. A cold feeling settled into my stomach, because this changed everything. Poor leadership is one thing, incompetence is one thing, but self-dealing, favoritism involving company money, that's different, very different. The worst part was that I still wasn't entirely sure how intentional it was. Maybe Jason genuinely believed these people were helping. Maybe he convinced himself the spending was justified. Maybe he simply stopped caring. At that point, the distinction barely mattered. The damage was real either way. I immediately contacted my father. Within hours, we were sitting in a conference room reviewing the evidence. I've never forgotten the look on his face. Not anger. Not shock, humiliation, pure humiliation. The kind that comes when you're forced to confront something you've spent years denying. He read every page twice, then a third time. The silence lasted several minutes. Finally, he spoke. "Does Jason know about this?" Michael answered. "Most of these approvals required his signature." Dad closed his eyes. The room became completely still. And for the first time since this entire crisis began, I saw something break inside him. Not financially, emotionally. The illusion, the fantasy, the belief that Jason simply needed more time, more support, more opportunities. That illusion died in that room, because the evidence was impossible to explain away. The board was informed later that afternoon. An emergency meeting was scheduled. Outside investigators were brought in. Auditors started reviewing everything. And suddenly Jason's problems became much larger than declining profits. By the end of the week, word had spread through the company. Not officially. Companies never work that way. Employees talk, managers talk, people connect dots. Everyone sensed something major was happening. Then came the emergency board meeting. The meeting Jason never expected. The meeting he couldn't charm his way through. The meeting where facts finally mattered more than family. I wasn't officially back with the company yet, but I attended as an advisor. Jason arrived 20 minutes late. That alone told me everything. He still thought he could control the narrative, still thought confidence would save him, still thought he was untouchable. The board chairman began presenting the findings. Page after page, contract after contract, payment after payment. Questions piled up faster than answers. The deeper the review went, the worse Jason looked. At first he denied everything, then he minimized it. Then he blamed subordinates. Then he blamed consultants. Then he blamed accounting. Then he blamed misunderstandings. The excuses kept changing because none of them worked. Eventually, one board member asked a question that cut straight through all the noise. "Did you approve these payments?" Silence. Another question. "Yes or no?" Jason looked around the room, searching for support, searching for an ally, searching for Dad. For the first time in his life, Dad looked away. And in that moment, Jason knew the protection was gone, completely gone. His answer came out barely above a whisper. "Yes." The room went silent. A silence so heavy you could feel it. Then the chairman spoke. "Effective immediately, your executive authority is suspended pending further review." Just like that. The heir, the successor, the future owner, gone, not because of me. Not because of office politics, because of his own actions. Jason stood up so abruptly his chair nearly tipped over. His face had gone completely pale. For a second I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then he looked directly at me, and I saw something terrifying, not regret, not shame, hatred, pure hatred. Because in his mind this was still somehow my fault, and judging by the look in his eyes he wasn't finished yet. Not even close. What nobody knew was that Jason had one last card to play. One final attempt to save himself. And that desperate gamble was about to explode so spectacularly that it would destroy his relationship with our father forever. 3 days after the board suspended Jason, my phone started exploding. Calls, texts, emails, messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. At first I thought news of the investigation had leaked. Then I started reading the messages. And I realized something else was happening, something ugly, something deliberate. Jason was fighting back, the only way he knew how, by blaming me. Again. Apparently he had spent the previous 48 hours contacting every relative, family friend, former employee, and business connection he could think of. And the story he was telling was unbelievable. According to Jason, I had orchestrated everything. The investigation, the board review, the financial scrutiny, the crisis, all of it. In his version of events, I had secretly sabotaged the company after leaving because I was jealous that he inherited leadership. I actually laughed when I heard it, not because it was funny, because it was pathetic. The company had nearly collapsed under 3 years of his leadership. There were documents, financial records, emails, witnesses, numbers, actual evidence. And somehow his explanation was still, Daniel is jealous. The same excuse he'd used since childhood, the same excuse that had protected him for decades. The difference was that this time nobody important believed it. At least not the people who mattered. The board didn't believe it. The auditors didn't believe it. The bank definitely didn't believe it. But some relatives did. Of course they did, because people love simple stories. And for years our family had been trained to view Jason as the successful son and me as the reliable backup. Changing that narrative required admitting they had been wrong. Most people hate doing that. A few days later I attended a family gathering at my mother's request. Honestly, I almost didn't go. I knew exactly what was waiting for me. The second I walked into my aunt's house, I felt it. The whispers, the glances, the tension. Like everyone was waiting for something. Then Uncle Richard approached. Richard had spent most of my life treating Jason like royalty, so I wasn't surprised when he got straight to the point. You should have handled this differently. I stared at him. Handled what differently? The company situation. There it was, the accusation hidden behind polite language. I could feel several relatives listening, watching, waiting. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel nervous. Because I wasn't carrying a secret. Jason was, so I simply asked a question. What exactly do you think happened? Richard launched into a version of events that sounded suspiciously similar to Jason's. Jealous brother, power struggle, family conflict, sabotage, victimhood, the usual nonsense. When he finally finished, I calmly pulled out my phone, then I opened a file, and another, financial reports, board findings, auditor summaries, nothing confidential. Just enough information to demonstrate reality. I handed him the phone. The room became quiet, very quiet. Richard's confidence disappeared page by page. Eventually, my aunt looked over his shoulder, then another relative, then another. Within minutes, half the room was reading, and the mood changed completely, because facts have a way of ruining comfortable lies. One relative finally broke the silence. Wait, she looked confused. These payments were approved by Jason. Nobody answered. The documents already had. Another relative spoke. He ignored these warnings. Again, the paperwork answered for us. Suddenly, the narrative started collapsing. Not because I argued, because evidence did the work. That's when my mother arrived. And what happened next is something I'll never forget. For years, my mother had tried to keep peace, avoid conflict, smooth things over, protect both sons. Not that day. That day she had reached her limit. One cousin asked whether the family should support Jason. Mom looked directly at him, then she said something nobody expected. No. The room froze, including me. Mom continued. Your father and I spent years protecting him from consequences. Silence. We told ourselves we were helping. More silence. We weren't helping. I had never heard her speak like that, not once, not in 40 years. The room listened. Nobody interrupted, nobody argued, because everyone could hear the truth in her voice. We made excuses for him. She looked around the room. And Daniel paid the price. That one hit hard. Because it was the first time anyone in my family had said it out loud. Not privately, not quietly, publicly, in front of everyone, the scapegoat, the overlooked son, the backup plan, finally being acknowledged. Several relatives looked embarrassed. Good, they should have. Some of them had spent decades contributing to the problem. Then came the final blow. The moment that permanently ended Jason's reign as the golden child. My father walked into the gathering, unexpectedly. Nobody had invited him, he simply showed up. The room immediately went silent. Dad looked exhausted, older than I'd ever seen him. Then he said 6 words. Words nobody thought they'd ever hear. Daniel deserved better than this. I genuinely didn't know how to react. Neither did anyone else, because those words represented 40 years of unspoken truth. The room remained silent. Then Dad added something even more shocking. I was wrong. Not Jason, not circumstances, not the economy, not bad luck. Him, he was wrong. And just like that, decades of family mythology shattered. The golden child story was over. Finished, dead. But while everyone else was finally accepting reality, Jason was preparing one last desperate move. A move so reckless that even my father would be unable to forgive it. Because when cornered, people reveal who they really are. And Jason was about to reveal exactly who he was. The fallout would cost him everything, including the one relationship he always assumed was unconditional. The call came at 5:47 in the morning. I remember the exact time because it woke me up. Nobody calls before 6 unless something is wrong. I answered immediately. It was my father. His voice sounded strange, flat, almost numb. Daniel, a pause, then 4 words. You need to come here. The moment I arrived at company headquarters, I knew something major had happened. Police vehicles were parked outside. Board members were standing near the entrance. Several senior managers looked shocked. Others looked furious. My stomach tightened, because whatever happened, it was serious, very serious. Then I found Dad. He was sitting alone in a conference room, staring at the table, looking completely broken. I've never forgotten that image, not because he looked weak, because he looked betrayed, and there is a difference. I sat down. What happened? Dad looked up. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Then he slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, bank records, transfer authorizations, financial activity reports. I read them once, then twice, then a third time, because my brain refused to accept what I was seeing. Jason had attempted to move company funds, not enough to disappear forever, not enough to buy an island, but enough to protect himself if the company collapsed. Enough to cushion his landing. Enough to put himself ahead of employees, creditors, and everyone else. The moment investigators uncovered the transfers, everything changed. The board's review became a formal legal matter. Lawyers got involved. Authorities got involved. And Jason's situation went from embarrassing to catastrophic. Dad's voice cracked. He knew we were fighting to save it. That was the part Dad couldn't get over. Not the money, not the headlines, not the humiliation, the betrayal. While everyone else was trying to save the company, Jason was trying to save himself, at everyone else's expense. The son Dad had defended his entire life had chosen himself over everything. Over employees, over family. Over the company, over Dad. And that realization shattered him. I looked at the paperwork again, then back at Dad. For the first time in my life, I realized something. Jason wasn't the only person facing consequences. Dad was too. Because favoritism always sends a bill eventually. And after 40 years, the bill had finally arrived. 3 months later, the company still existed. Barely, but it existed. That fact alone felt like a miracle. Not because I performed some magical turnaround, not because I was a genius, but because hundreds of employees refused to give up. Managers worked overtime. Teams accepted temporary sacrifices. People fought for a company that had nearly been destroyed by one man's ego. And slowly, painfully, things improved. Lost clients started returning. Operations stabilized. Debt was restructured. Trust began rebuilding. For the first time in years, there was hope. The board officially offered me the position of Chief Executive Officer. When the vote happened, it was unanimous. Unanimous. The word felt strange. For most of my life, every room had treated Jason as the obvious choice. Now the same people were choosing me without hesitation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially my father. By then, Dad had stepped away from day-to-day operations. Not because he was forced out, because he finally understood something. The company needed leadership based on merit, not bloodline. A lesson that had cost him nearly everything to learn. One afternoon, he asked me to meet him in the old office. His office. The room where I'd spent decades trying to earn approval. The room where Jason's future had been planned. The room where my own future had often been ignored. When I entered, Dad was standing by the window. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he handed me a small wooden box. I opened it. Inside was my grandfather's old company watch. The one passed down through leadership generations. The one everyone assumed would go to Jason. Dad's voice was quiet. Your grandfather gave this to me when I took over. I stared at the watch. Unable to speak, he continued. I always thought I'd give it to your brother. There was no bitterness in his voice anymore, only regret. Years and years of regret. Then he looked directly at me. Your grandfather would have chosen you. Those 6 words hit harder than any apology ever could, because they carried the weight of everything that had happened. Everything that should have happened. Everything that never did. I looked away for a moment. Not because I was angry, because I suddenly felt emotional in a way I hadn't expected. 40 years. 40 years of trying, 40 years of proving myself, 40 years of standing in someone else's shadow. And now, at the very end, the truth had finally been spoken. Dad sat down heavily. He looked older than ever. "Can you forgive me?" The question hung in the air, heavy, complicated, painful, because forgiveness isn't a switch. You don't simply decide and move on. Not after decades, not after a lifetime. I thought carefully before answering. Then I told him the truth. "I don't know," Dad nodded, like he'd expected that answer, so I continued. "But I don't hate you anymore." And that was true. Somewhere along the way, the anger had disappeared, not because what happened was okay, because carrying it stopped helping me. My life wasn't defined by Jason anymore, or Dad, or the company. I had built my own success, my own family, my own future. The approval I'd spent decades chasing no longer controlled me. And somehow that freedom felt better than revenge, much better. As for Jason, his ending was far less peaceful. The investigation continued. Civil lawsuits followed. Several former business associates turned against him almost immediately. The friends who enjoyed company-funded dinners vanished. The people who praised him disappeared. The supporters who loved being close to power suddenly stopped answering calls. Funny how that works. Within a year, Jason had lost nearly everything: his executive position, his reputation, most of his social circle, his luxury lifestyle, even the vacation home he'd purchased during the company's decline. Gone, sold, liquidated, finished. The most brutal part wasn't financial, it was psychological. For the first time in his life, nobody was coming to rescue him. No father stepping in, no family making excuses, no employees cleaning up the mess, no younger brother fixing the consequences, just Jason, alone, facing reality. I saw him only once after everything ended. It happened by accident, a grocery store, of all places. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me, and I noticed something I'd never seen before: humility. Not complete humility, not a magical transformation, just enough to recognize that life had changed. He glanced away, then quietly said, "You got what you wanted." Years earlier, I might have argued, defended myself, explained everything. Not anymore. I simply answered, "No." He looked confused. I continued, "I got what I earned." And for the first time in his life, he had no response, because deep down he knew it was true. The funny thing about karma is that people imagine it as revenge. It isn't. Not really. Real karma is much simpler. It's when reality finally arrives, when excuses stop working, when favoritism runs out, when effort matters, when truth catches up. Jason wasn't destroyed by me. He was destroyed by years of decisions nobody forced him to make. My father wasn't humbled by me. He was humbled by the consequences of believing love meant avoiding accountability. And me, I wasn't saved by karma. I was saved by finally walking away from people who refused to see my worth. Because the greatest victory wasn't becoming CEO. It wasn't inheriting the company. It wasn't watching Jason fall. The greatest victory was realizing I never needed their permission to succeed. And once I understood that, nobody could ever make me feel second best again.